The file I opened that morning was thin. 18 months of observation, behavioral logs, dietary accommodation records, a single psychological profile note reading, unremarkable. The human detainee had been at Orvith 9, longer than any specimen we had processed in the station's 8-year operational history, and she'd generated less data than a specimen held for 3 weeks. That, I should have understood, was itself data. My name is Vel Saran. I served as senior analyst for the classification directorate, keth ascendancy, a body responsible for assessing captured or surrendered members of newly encountered species and assigning them to one of 11 risk categories that governed everything from diplomatic contact protocol to containment architecture. I had processed specimens from 41 distinct species in my career. I had issued classification upgrades on 4 occasions, all of which were later reviewed and found warranted. I had never been asked to explain why I had allowed a misclassification to persist for over a year. I was asked that question once. The tribunal that convened on the matter of Dr. Voss was, officially, a routine reclassification review. She had arrived at Orvith 9 as part of a small diplomatic exploratory delegation that had made first contact with patrol units near the outer arm of the Vareth corridor. The delegation had been detained pending assessment, standard procedure when an unknown species initiates contact without prior treaty framework. 3 of the 4 delegation members had been processed, categorized, and transferred to low oversight diplomatic holding within 60 days. Dr. Voss had remained because she had been assigned to our behavioral science team for extended study. She was, the initial intake note said, cooperative, healthy, and intellectually engaged with the process. She had expressed interest in understanding our assessment methods and had been given limited orientation materials as a goodwill measure. She had asked few questions of operational relevance. She had been assessed as Category 3, sapient, non-aggressive, low autonomy threat, unremarkable survival instinct, no observable territorial behavior, no predatory markers in physiological or behavioral baseline. Category 3 was where we put librarians, agricultural administrators, and record keepers. I want to be precise about what I knew and did not know when I opened the cross-examination that morning. I knew that Dr. Voss held an academic title in what human records described as cognitive ecology, the study of how organisms model their environments. I had noted it as a soft science credential of limited relevance and had not returned to it. I knew she had been allowed limited movement within the station's secondary wing for the final 6 months of her detention, on the recommendation of the behavioral team, who felt that supervised environmental access would produce more accurate socialization data. I knew she had never attempted to communicate outside sanctioned channels, had never been found with unauthorized materials, had never raised her voice to a member of the assessment staff. I did not know, when I opened that morning's session, that I was about to understand what Category 3 had actually meant. The chamber was small, panel seats, a central examination table, a recording array. The human sat across from us without restraint, a decision made by my predecessor and never revisited, since she had given no reason to revisit it. She was a mid-career woman, lean and pale in the particular way of people who have spent years in climate-controlled institutional spaces, with close-cut dark hair and a way of sitting that suggested she found chairs slightly too large for her. She was dressed in the standard issue gray clothing we provided all detainees. She looked at me when I sat down with the same even, assessing look she had given every assessor since her arrival, and I noticed, and then did not think about, the fact that her eyes moved briefly to each of the 2 other panel members before returning to me. I began with procedural formalities: name, origin designation, occupational classification. She gave them cleanly. Keth language fluency was good. We had provided her with instructional materials early in her detention, and she had progressed faster than our acquisition models had predicted, though not so fast that it had triggered a flag. I noted this in my margin record. The first unusual moment came when I asked her to describe in her own words what she understood the purpose of her continued detention to be. She said, without hesitation, You're trying to decide whether I'm dangerous. That was not in itself remarkable. Most sapient detainees understood the broad purpose of classification assessment. What I noticed was the quality of the statement. Not anxious, not resentful, not performatively cooperative. It was the flat acknowledgement of a fact she had simply been sitting with for 14 months, the way a person acknowledges weather. There was no accompanying question. No. And have you decided? Or what happens if you decide yes? She stated it and waited. With the same patience she appeared to bring to everything, as though she had made her peace with the question's answer, long before I had arrived to pose it. I confirmed that her understanding was essentially correct. I asked her whether she had any concerns about the process. She said, "Not really. I've been using the time." I recorded that as a positive behavioral indicator: self-directed occupation, psychological resilience, no unproductive fixation on captivity. I moved to the substantive questions. I should note, for the record, that I had reviewed the behavioral team's 14 months of observation logs the evening before the tribunal. They were thorough and professionally assembled, and they documented nothing alarming. Dr. Voss had been an attentive and curious detainee, engaged with the orientation materials we had provided, interested in the assessment team's work, occasionally asking questions about keth institutional structure that the team had logged as normal intellectual curiosity, and answered, within clearance guidelines, accordingly. She had learned the keth language well and used it consistently. She had shown no signs of psychological deterioration over the extended detention period, which the team noted as a marker of either unusual emotional resilience or an unusually stable internal orientation. They had found it difficult to determine which, and had noted as much in the final behavioral summary. I had read that note the night before and thought it meant she was psychologically robust. I read it again later and understood it differently. We began with the standard cognitive mapping battery, a series of questions designed to probe how a specimen understood and organized environmental information. The battery had been developed over 30 years and was tuned to detect territorial anxiety, resource-hoarding cognition, and predatory spatial memory, three markers that correlated reliably with Category 7 and above. Questions were not presented as a test. They were presented as casual conversational probes embedded in a broader interview. We had found that direct testing produced elevated physiological stress responses that contaminated the data. The conversational approach produced cleaner results. First probe asked her to describe what she had found most interesting about Orvith 9 since her arrival. She considered this for a moment. Not long. The way someone considers a question they find slightly beneath their full engagement, and then said she had found the shift change protocols interesting. The way the secondary wing staff cycled on an irregular interval pattern. She had noticed it took her about 6 weeks to identify the underlying schedule logic, because it was not immediately apparent that the intervals were irregular by design rather than by operational convenience. I noted this as a demonstration of analytical curiosity, consistent with her academic background. I asked her what had made her curious about the shift patterns. She said, "I wanted to know when the wing was at minimum staff." There was a pause at the panel table. It was brief. I filled it immediately by asking a follow-up that was slightly too smoothly delivered. And I think she noticed, because there was a faint adjustment in her expression. Not guilt, not alarm. Something closer to acknowledgement. Before she answered, she asked because irregular staffing patterns suggested competing operational priorities, and understanding those priorities was basic environmental modeling. She had not needed the information for any particular reason. She just modeled environments. It was what she did. I moved the battery forward. The next probe asked her to describe, from memory, the physical layout of the spaces she had been given access to. She described them with a precision that took me a full minute to recognize as extraordinary, not detailed in the way of an anxious detainee who had memorized her surroundings out of self-protective vigilance. There was none of that texture to it. No emotional weight, no dwelling on the locked sections or the guard positions. She described the layout the way someone describes a diagram they made themselves. Factually, efficiently, with the kind of structural clarity that comes from having filed information away with the intention of using it later. When she reached the junction corridor on level 4, a service passage she had been walked through twice, and escorted en route to a scheduled medical evaluation, she described the location of the manual junction seal overrides, the sequential position of the emergency pressure hatches, and the approximate load-bearing interval of the corridor's internal partition walls. She had been through that corridor twice. I stopped her. I asked her to clarify why she had noted the junction seal positions. She looked at me with the same even expression she had maintained throughout the session and said, "Because they're the fastest way to segment the wing in an emergency, to unsegment it, depending on the emergency." The junior assessor to my left made a note. The senior researcher to my right had gone very still. I asked her, keeping my voice at the same administrative register I had used throughout, whether she had noted similar things in other areas of the station she had accessed. She said yes. She said she had notes, actually. She had been keeping a written record. With permission, the behavioral team had encouraged her to journal as a mental health practice. She had several notebooks. She had assumed someone had been reviewing them. She looked at me with what I can only describe as the patient expression of someone who has just explained something obvious to a person they respect enough not to make that observation aloud. Nobody had been reviewing the notebooks. The behavioral team had logged them as personal wellness documents and filed them without content analysis, pursuant to a directorate guidance note about privacy considerations in long-term detainee welfare programs. We recessed the tribunal. I read the notebooks that afternoon, all 6 of them. I want to be careful about how I describe what I found in those notebooks, because I have spent a considerable amount of time since then trying to understand exactly what Dr. Vos was and was not doing during her 14 months on Orvith 9, and I believe precision matters here. She was not planning an escape. There was no evidence in the notebooks of a worked tactical plan, no mapped routes to external docking, no attempt to understand navigational or propulsion systems, no analysis of communication arrays or external security architecture. She was not building a weapon. She was not suborning the staff. Her documentation of individual staff members was strictly behavioral and positional, not personal or manipulative. What she had done was this. She had built from 14 months of passive observation and free access to orientation materials provided by the directorate itself, a complete functional model of Orvith 9's command and response architecture. She knew the duty hierarchy. She knew which roles held decision-making authority in which categories of incident. She knew the communication lag between Orvith 9 and the directorate's nearest oversight relay, because she had logged the timing pattern of the behavioral team's outgoing reports and the intervals before procedural changes were issued in response. She knew the station's 3 structural weak points, 2 of them known to the engineering team, 1 of them not yet formally documented, because she had spent time in proximity to them, registered the acoustic and atmospheric characteristics, and filed the observations under environmental notes in her 3rd notebook. 4th notebook was the one that took me the longest to work through. It contained what she had titled, in keth, Institutional Behavioral Ecology, a systematic analysis of the decision-making patterns she had observed in the behavioral team's staff. Not surveillance in any manipulative sense, more like a naturalist's field record. She had noted which team members were deferential to senior staff and which operated with more autonomy. She had noted whose reports tended to be acted on quickly and whose sat in the relay queue for longer, which she had inferred from the interval pattern between report submission and procedural update. She had noted, in 3 succinct lines, that the team's senior researcher made faster assessments but sometimes overcorrected for novelty, and that a mid-level assessor, whose name I recognized from the station roster, was likely to flag concerns accurately but understate their urgency in formal documentation. due to what she described as an institutional harmony disposition. She had arrived at these assessments from 14 months of ordinary professional interaction in the context of her own assessment, supervised interviews, escorted appointments, group orientation sessions. She had done all of this the way a person breathes, not as a project, not as a plan, as the automatic operation of a mind that could not stop cataloging, mapping, and filing away the structural logic of any environment it was placed in. I read the notebooks twice. Then I called the station's chief structural engineer, who reviewed her notes about the undocumented weak point, and told me, with the particular flatness of someone suppressing a more dramatic response, that her assessment was correct within a margin of error he was unwilling to speculate about, until he had conducted a full survey. We reconvened the tribunal the following morning. Dr. Voss sat in the same chair with the same expression. She had slept. The overnight monitoring record indicated 8 hours without interruption. I had slept approximately 2. I began by telling her that we had reviewed her notebooks. She said she was glad. She said she had hoped we would find them useful. I asked her whether she had understood, when she was producing them, that the information they contained might be considered sensitive. She considered this, with what appeared to be genuine thoughtfulness. Shh. Then she said something that I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count in the years since. She said, "I didn't produce the information. It was already there. I just noticed it." I asked her to explain what she meant. She said that the shift patterns, the junction seals, the command hierarchy, the structural signatures, none of it had been hidden. It was all present in her environment, accessible to anyone who looked at it with the right kind of attention. She had not been searching for vulnerabilities. She had been existing in a space, and her mind had organized what it found the way a compass needle organizes to north. She wasn't sure it was possible for her to not do that. She had been doing it since she was a child. In every room she had ever entered. I asked her whether she had done it on purpose. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I can only describe as gently puzzled. The way someone looks when asked whether they breathe on purpose, she said. It's just how we see we. I want to note what that word did to the chamber. 2 assessors on either side of me both heard it. None of us said anything for several seconds. I asked her whether she meant to say that this was common among humans. This automatic environmental modeling, this passive cataloging of structural and command architecture in any space they occupied. She said she couldn't speak for all humans, but that in her field, cognitive ecology, the baseline ability was well documented, and she was considered to be in approximately the middle of the human distribution for it, not exceptional, average. She said the people she knew who were genuinely exceptional at it were the ones who had gone into fields that required it: special operations, intelligence work, emergency medicine, architecture. She had a colleague who could walk into a building once and tell you, without reviewing notes, where the load-bearing walls were, which exits were realistic under various pressure scenarios, and how many people would need to be moved through which choke points at what rate in a structural emergency. She said that colleague was a trauma surgeon who had developed the habit in field hospitals. I asked Dr. Voss whether she had tried to communicate any of her assessments to her former delegation members who had been transferred to diplomatic holding at a separate facility. She said no. She said she had assumed the information would be more useful here to us, in the form she had documented it. If we were assessing humans for classification purposes, she thought an accurate functional map of our own station was probably a useful baseline demonstration. I looked at her for a long time before I asked my next question. I asked her whether she had intended the notebooks as a demonstration of human cognitive capability. She said she had intended them as a courtesy. The tribunal was adjourned shortly after. The formal record indicates that the session was closed due to an administrative matter requiring senior directorate consultation. The actual reason was that the chief researcher on the panel needed to leave the room. I filed my reclassification recommendation 48 hours later. The process that followed took 4 months. involved consultation with 11 senior directorate analysts, and produced a 700-page assessment that I was asked to contribute to, and that I have never, in the years since its classification, been permitted to discuss in full detail. What I can say is that the human classification framework was restructured from 11 categories to 17, and that the new framework introduced, for the first time in directorate history, a distinct marker for species whose primary threat profile derives not from aggression, weaponry, or physical capability, but from the automatic and involuntary operation of a perceptual architecture that treats every environment as a system to be understood. We had a category for predators. We had a category for colonial organisms. We had a category for hive cognition collectives, and for species with distributed threat capability, and for organisms whose biological processes constituted weapons-grade hazards. We did not have a category for a species that walks into a room and, without trying, without intending to, without any particular focus or malice, simply maps it, files it, keeps it every room, for their entire lives. We have that category now. In the years since the Voss Tribunal, I have spoken to colleagues in other directorate branches who were processing human specimens through assessment during the same period. Several of them reported similar anomalies, patterns they had logged as analytical curiosity or academic habit, and had not elevated to classification review. One colleague in the Eastern Relay Cluster described a human detainee who had spent 8 months producing what the behavioral team had categorized as speculative recreational writing. World building, they had called it, a hobby common among the species. The writing, when finally reviewed following a directorate-wide guidance update, turned out to contain an accurate hypothetical model of the directorate's interstellar communication routing network, derived entirely from the information visible in the station's public access orientation materials, and the interval patterns of routine administrative functions the detainee had been able to observe from a common area monitoring screen. The detainee had been told this was recreational. He had shrugged and said he was writing science fiction. True. He had been writing infrastructure analysis without knowing that was what he was doing, possibly knowing exactly what he was doing. We were not entirely certain which. That uncertainty, the review committee noted, was itself the finding. Dr. Voss was transferred to diplomatic holding 6 weeks after the tribunal, where she joined her former delegation members and participated in the early formal contact protocols that eventually produced the Verith Corridor Accords. The behavioral team's notes on her final weeks at Orvith 9 describe her as cooperative, comfortable, and apparently pleased to have been useful. The structural survey of Orvith 9, completed in the months following the tribunal, identified 2 additional undocumented maintenance concerns beyond the one she had noted. Both had been present for years. She had identified hers from 2 corridor transits, 2 years of acoustic ambient data absorbed while moving between scheduled appointments, and whatever internal process her mind ran automatically in every space it occupied. The engineer's report noted, in dry technical language, that she had been correct. I returned to the tribunal record once, a long time after. There was a notation I had made during the first session, in my margin record, that I had never revisited. When she sat down and her eyes moved briefly to each panel member before settling on me, I had recorded. Standard orientation response. No significant markers. I looked at it for a while. Then I updated it to read, initial assessment of the panel's decision-making hierarchy, completed in under 3 seconds. Filed. I don't think she was aware that she had done it. That is the part that I have never entirely been able to set aside. Not the accuracy, not the scope, not the fact that an average human, held in our facility as a Category 3 detainee, had built a more detailed operational model of our station than most of our own staff possessed. What I can't set aside is that she had done it without noticing. The same way she breathed. I recommended, in my final report, that the directorate revise its approach to human behavioral assessment from the ground up. The specific language I used has been quoted back to me a number of times in the years since by people who found it either useful or alarmist, depending on their role and their temperament. I wrote, "The danger is not that humans are hostile. The danger is that they cannot be in a room without understanding it." I stand by that. I think it is the most precise sentence I have ever written in 30 years of classification work. Orvith 9 was restructured before the accords were finalized. Junction seals were repositioned, the weak point addressed. The staff rotation intervals, randomized on a new interval pattern. Revised protocols were classified at the highest directorate tier. I reviewed them before filing. I noted that we had addressed every structural concern Dr. Voss had documented. I did not note, in the filing, that I had spent 4 minutes after reviewing them trying to determine whether any of the new protocols had introduced new patterns that a sufficiently attentive observer might eventually map. I wasn't able to be certain they hadn't. I filed the protocols and went home. I slept badly for the first time in my career in a room I had occupied for 11 years and never once thought to understand.